Disturb us, O Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we dream too little, when we have arrived in safety because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, O Lord, when with the abundance of things we have lost our thirst for the water of life, when having fallen in love with time, we have ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build the new earth, have allowed our vision for the new heaven to grow dim, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas, where storm shall show thy mastery, where losing sight of land we shall find the stars. And in the name of him who pushed back the horizons of our hopes and invited the brave to follow him. Amen. Maayong good morning sa tanan, as Bishop Tudtud used to say, because he
Maayong good
believed
morning.
because he believed that the world is my home and somewhere in it, at every moment, the sun is shining. And so, maayong good morning. So welcome, everybody, to our third webinar. Is it the third, Father Rex? No? Fourth na pala, to our fourth webinar. Our speaker this afternoon does not need any introduction, pero I'd like to introduce him in my own way because Xavier had given him the doctorate, no, honoris causa. Ateneo de Manila University has also awarded him the Davao. I think there is this, ano ngalan ato gani, Brother Karl, kato sa Davao, Dato Bago. Daghan kay ni siya award. Dili na siya angay unta i-introduce. Pero para nako, ako siyang pwede i-introduce sa iyang pagkalumad, no? Niya paryente ni siya ni King Gaspar. Anyway, why lumad? Una sa tanan, because I think our speaker is a lover good of life, no? Mahigugmaon sa kinabuhi, a lover of life, lover of wisdom, lover of truth, ug uban pa. And he is undeniably a virtuous man and very unyielding to forces of evil. Suklan gini, no? Basta puwersang dautan. And he's a mentor of many young aspiring anthropologists, sociologists, holy men and women, aspiring writers, aspiring artists. Mentor ni siya sa daghang mga tao. Apil na mo, apil na ta. And of course, he is somebody who is known for his being an artist. Kanta, sa pa man eh, painting siguro, apil na ani, patiga siguro sculpting, of course, poetry, writing, acting, dancing. I don't know, Brother Karl, na ba di mo mahimo, pero I think dancing also. I think this man used to dance a lot. And of course, D for dialogue. I think he's a person of dialogue, of life and faith, and his friendship with the late Bishop Tudtud has even further deepened his being a person of dialogue. My friends, brothers, and sisters, without further ado, let us all welcome Brother Karl Gaspar of the Congregation of the Holy Redeemer. Take it away, Brother Karl.
Daghang salamat, Venus. So, nakahadlok man tong virtuous.
Sugot na lang, good.
Sige na lang. Naihapon sa tanan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really very pleased and very honored to be able to address you this afternoon when I was invited by the conveners group for this session of remembering and giving tribute to Tatay Bido. I certainly did not hesitate because it's an area where I think I might be able to share a little bit given my experience with him in this particular area. I will be relying on Arlene, who will be operating the PowerPoint. So can we begin now, Arlene? And you project it, please. So, Tatay Bido and the Lumad Ministry in Mindanao was the title that I thought would be appropriate for this afternoon session. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to situate my sharing today also in the context of the 500th year commemoration of the arrival of the Spanish colonizers in our islands. Mainly because, of course, the first to embrace Christianity were our indigenous ancestors. And from those who embraced Christianity, they then also shared it with other indigenous people. So that in itself is already a very good point of reference for our sharing this afternoon. In the course of my talk this afternoon, I hope it will be under 30 minutes because I'm sure you'll all be very tired if I speak more than that. I will have about 5 or 6 sections that I will be speaking about. First, I will have to do a little bit of looking back to the Spanish colonial regime, especially in the context of the 500th year, which explains why today we have this phenomenon called the presence of indigenous peoples as they are distinguished from other Filipinos. Kay sa tinood lang, 500 years ago, we were all indigenous. Pero nga naman, some of us are not anymore referred to as Lumad or IPs, but there are still those who are. And along that particular line, it will be interesting also to just say a little bit about how the Spanish friars evangelized our ancestors. Then I'll shift immediately into the American occupation and deal with the fact that it was really the American missionaries who were able to do more proselytization among IP communities, especially here in Mindanao, and then moved on to the period of our republic, where policies also arose, which reinforced what Levinas would speak of as the othering of others, and in Mindanao, in the Philippines, would be how we have othered both the Moro people and the Lumad people. And and given that particular context, I then look at how the church has responded to the various epochs: Spanish regime, American occupation, the early years of the Republic, post-Vatican II until today. And that's then where I situate Tatay Bido and the Lumad Ministry, and then end it with a little bit of sharing on the legacy of Tatay Bido for contemporary Lumad Ministry in Mindanao. Next slide, please. The commemoration, of course, of the arrival of Christianity will take center stage next year. And hopefully, the pandemic will be gone and it will be possible to really come up with celebrations for this commemoration. As I said already, before the colonial period, all of us Filipinos were indigenous, whether you were Cebuano or Waray or Ilocano or Mandaya or Mansaka or Tiboli, tanan man ta mga lumad. Pero karon naapay nagpabilin ng mga lugar where still people were referred to as indigenous peoples. And again, this is as a result of the colonization evangelization. Look at the logo of the CBCP and the theme, Gifted to Give. And this will be a very interesting theme to follow also for our Lumad Ministry for next year. Next slide, please. If we look at the statistics of indigenous peoples today, I tried to look at some available statistics. No, so I looked for data from the Philippine Statistics Office. There is this group called Pew, and there is also this group called Asia Society. And the figures vary in terms of the percentages of total Filipino population vis-a-vis our religious affiliations. So the Statistics Office says that 92% of all Filipinos around this time are Christians. Of the 92%, 81% are Catholics and 11% are Protestants. The data from Pew, they only have the total Christian population, which is 92.6% of total population. From Asia Society, it's a little different from the two other sources. They indicate that 94% of the total population of the Philippines are Christians, Of this, 86% are Catholics and 8% are Protestants. So if you look at the column under Muslims, the data from the statistics offices, they are 6% of total population. Pew would say 5.5, and Asian society is a little bit smaller, 4%. But if you look at folk religion, and here you could bring it to the indigenous faith believers, mga lumad, nga nagpabilin sa ilang kaugalingong pagtuo. The data from the statistics lump everyone together, the Buddhists, the Shintoists, even the atheists and the lumad together, and they total only 2%. From Pew, they say 1.5% still practice folk religion and 1% other religions. And Asia Society say 2%. Okay, next slide, please. But these are very inaccurate figures, and I really have problems with statistics. I even wrote an essay on the politics of statistics now because look at look at the population as they are estimated today vis-a-vis the indigenous peoples throughout the Philippines. If one goes by the three sets, namely the one of the statistics, the Pew and the Asia Society, the average percentage would be only 1% of total population. Now, considering we are what, 15 million now, that's only about 1,100,000 people. That would be the only IPs in the Philippines today by way of their religious affiliation. But if you look at the data from the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, they say percentage of Lumad population in the Philippines could be 11 to 12% of the total population, which is roughly 11 million. The International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs also say that the percentage population of Lumad in the Philippines today is between 10 and 20%. Therefore, that 1 or 2% of the official sources earlier cannot be because look at the existing population vis-a-vis the other sources. So I'm really saying that in terms of those that are holding on to their indigenous belief system is much more that being reported. Next slide, please. Now, I assume we're all very familiar with indigenous life, no? And we are all then familiar about the different elements. I'm just bringing them in here because it will all link to the end of my talk. Indigenous cultures, identity have this sort of elements. Everything and everyone are linked to each other. There are no fragmentations. There are no dualisms. Communalism is key to their identity. That's why the ownership of land and property is communal, and celebrations are always communal. And that the ultimate owner of whatever is in the habitat, in the environment, is the acknowledged deity in whatever name it's called, Bathala, Manama, Apusandawa, and so on. It follows then that all of nature is considered sacred. And that is why anything that they take out of Mother Nature, they perform a ritual to ask permission, which is an acknowledgement of how holy, how sacred everything is in their habitat. If life is taken away, you need to reciprocate this. And that's why there are rituals. And a symbol of the rituals is blood, because blood is, of course, the symbol of life. Kinship is very strong and it's centered on an extended family. That's why families are big. And within these tribes, these clans, women and children are not discriminated. In fact, women have very strong traditional roles in IP society. And if we speak about art, art is not commodified. There's no such thing as buying an artwork. Next slide, please. What happened during the Spanish evangelization? I hope some of you are familiar with Vincent Rafael's book entitled Contracting Colonialism, published by Ateneo de Manila University Press. It's a very good book to help us understand how that whole colonization process took place, because he would refer to the entire process of colonization, evangelization, and even translation. You really have to read the book to be fully able to understand the whole dynamic of the interrelationship here. But some of the things that he would pose is this, that we got colonized, which meant our indigenous ancestors were dominated by a powerful colonizer who used force to impose what they decided what was good for us. And the whole power dynamics in which Christianity was introduced had to be taken into consideration in terms of the conversion process. You know, the whole dynamic of power was very much at work here. Next slide, please. When colonization took place, immediately the colonizers found it very difficult to dominate over the people whose abode was very far from each other. Because even today, if you go to really traditional indigenous communities, they don't live cramped together, no clusters of houses. They live where they can have access to food, whether they are hunters, food gatherers, or even already food cultivators. So that's why the reduction was introduced, and I'm sure every one of you understand the reduction. But what followed the reduction was the establishment of the encomienda systems. And the encomienda system was really a source of abuse, of brutalities, because here is where the colonizers uh, ex, you know, establish the system of tribute, and these tributes can be so exorbitant. And there's what they call the polo y servicio, the forced labor, and also the vandala system. These were really very oppressive, and many historians would bring us back to what took place within this encomienda system. And no wonder that there were hundreds of revolts that took place throughout the whole Spanish regime. Unfortunately, the religious congregations also eventually owned the encomiendas, which later on also became haciendas. No? Next slide, please. So as I said already, the first converts were our Lumad ancestors. From then on, other Lumads, and it spread. Okay. You think there were what 333 years of Spanish regime? That's a very long time. They really managed to stay here for a long time, and since there was religious conversion, proselytization, naturally, wherever the colonizers and the friars were able to reach out to this population, the conversion process took place. It took a long while before the natives who got converted to Catholicism gave up on their indigenous belief system, because they had to. There was that whole dynamic there. They expressed great fear that they might face the revenge of the gods if they turned faithless to their native beliefs, because then there were very strong attachment to their deities, to their gods and goddesses in whichever territories they were in. But then they realized that the threat of their native religion perishing, eventually disappearing, was really very real. No? So this particular shift from practicing their indigenous belief system towards embracing Christianity as introduced by the friars must have created such a deep source of anguish for them, as their they have to give up their ancestors in exchange for this Christian God. And that would have threatened, and they realized that it was not just giving up on their belief system, it was giving up on their whole traditional way of life, their identity even. So it was like a death of their way of life. And that's why eventually, not just the ships, no, but even the Babaylans yielded to the pressure to join the rest of the population who got convinced about reality, what's happening. I'm repeating myself. Is it okay now? Okay, so the last group to surrender who gave up on the indigenous belief systems were the Babaylans. Feminist studies in the Philippines today are revisiting that particular part of our history, and there are some studies that are now appearing in regard to the brutalities that were done, that were inflicted on the women babaylan. They were mostly women. That's why they're known as babaylan or babaylang. And many of them were very influential, powerful even, the friars were very intimidated by them. And so there was a bit of harassment and persecution and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. At the end of the Spanish colonial regime, who were the ones impacted by this colonization? Namely, those of us who ultimately embraced Catholicism and developed a culture very different from those of our ancestors. So mainly the Tagalogs and the Cebuanos and the Warais and the Bicolanos and the Ilocanos and so on and so forth. But a very substantial segment of our population, like those in the north, the Cordilleras in Palawan and the Aita, the locations in Luzon, no, they did not. Either they rejected it and moved beyond the reach of the friars, or they could not be reached by the colonizers because they were just out there in the very isolated mountains. In the central part, the Visayas, because of the nature of the islands of the Visayas, it was easier to colonize. And that's why today there are only very few pockets of IPs in the Visayas, and they're mainly the Aitas, the Atis, and so on. But Mindanao is something else. The colonizers and the friars really found it very, very difficult. Although there were very brave inroads into Mindanao, especially among the Jesuits. But because the Islamic faith was already well established here, and many Lumad populations were just out there in the mountains, so isolated, there was a very substantial number of people that never got colonized. And these are the groups of people who remained indigenous up to the American occupation until some of them also were evangelized by the Protestants. Next slide, please. Mindanao, as you all know, have a very good number of uh, indigenous communities everywhere. And the Zamboanga Peninsula, you have the Subanon up there in Surigao. There used to be the Camayo. To Agusan, Surigao, you have the Banoaon, Manobo, around the Davao region, Mandaya, Mansaka, Misamis Oriental towards Bukidnon, Higaonon, Manobo, towards South Cotabato, Tiduray, Bukidnon, North Cotabato, Matigsalog, Davao, Bagubo, Tagacolo, blah. And they're still there until today. Next slide, please. When the Americans took over, there were very important implications in terms of the American occupation. Mindanao got open to migrants through the homestead program. That also led to the entry of corporate plantations, which led to the dislocation of Moro and Lumad peoples from their ancestral domain. And so with the American aggressive colonial policy for Mindanao, more areas got colonized. But IP communities who were then living by the side of the sea, by the rivers, by the lakes, when migrant settlers and corporations began to take over ancestral domain, they moved further south until, of course, the time came there are no more places where they can transfer to because forests would have been gone and ancestral domain have been taken away from them. Next slide, please. Next slide. The whole American process involved, in very general terms, the following: the suppression of the rebellions. We all know there was a Philippine-American War. The remnants of the Katipunan continued their resistance against the American occupation, which was not only in Luzon but even parts of Visayas. But eventually they got vanquished. Their aim was the so-called civilization agenda to civilize the natives through benevolent assimilation. They did introduce universal education and in the process began to introduce English as a medium of instruction. Thomasites arrived here. Some of them were from here and then went to study abroad, came back, some coming from the US. And they even doubled as missionaries because many of them were also Protestants. And as they taught, they also brought in religion. And they also wanted to Christianize us, except that since most of them were Protestants, it was to bring us towards the Protestant side of Christianity. Next slide, please. As most Filipinos had embraced Catholicism, the Protestants concentrated their conversion process with the middle class in the Luzon and the indigenous peoples in isolated communities. They knew it was very difficult to do proselytization among hardcore Catholics in the parishes spread across the archipelago, even here in Mindanao, where already some foreign missionaries were established. So they decided to move up to the mountains and then proselytize the indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. They even established the so-called Summer Institute of Linguistics, and there was a major one in Malaybalay. It's gone now. They had closed that for a number of years, but there's still an office, I think, in Manila. The SIL, they coded the Lumad language. They had linguists, they had researchers and so on. And they went and immersed themselves among the indigenous peoples with their tape recorders and whatever skills they have in linguistics. And they were able to decode the Lumad languages for purposes of translating the Bible into the Lumad. In that sense, they're advanced in their inculturation of the use of the scriptures, because they knew it was impossible to teach the Bible in English or in Spanish or in Latin. So this Bible were then used by the American missionaries, but an positive thing there was that also as they were doing this, because they also needed to quote, educate the natives and engaged in adult literacy. So they developed literacy materials. In fact, when I was working with the Philippine Business for Social Progress, I got in touch with them in Malaybalay because I wanted to have access to their materials in terms of the IP work that we were doing at the time. Next slide, please. As most Spanish friars left the country, and we know why, of course, after the Philippine National Revolution really expanded throughout the archipelago, there were very few Filipino clergy, because part of the problem also of the Spanish regime was it was not very aggressive in developing the native clergy. Whatever native clergy was then were very small and few. And you also know that there were problems between the friars and the diocesan clergy. Fortunately, there were new arrivals from Europe and North America who were coming into the Philippines and were very interested in Mindanao, because Mindanao certainly was a mission territory. But their concern were mainly to administer to already the extensive number of parishes across Luzon and Visayas, and later on, even the ones that were being established in Mindanao as migrant settlers who were expanding in various parts of Mindanao. So only a few of them had the interest or the capability to be able to go to isolated mountain villages to work among IP communities, which is why it was the Protestant missionaries that were able to do more conversion in the IP communities. Next slide, please. There were newly established parishes across Mindanao at this particular period, because as I said, the migrant settlers were expanding, and mostly, of course, were Catholics, and so there was a desire to have a priest available here in Mindanao. Earlier, of course, we know that it was the Jesuits that were really taking over, that were administering the needs of the new converts in Mindanao until there was the expulsion. The Recollects took over. Of course, later on, the Jesuits were able to come back. But they were the only ones. And so when the Americans took over, there was really a dearth of missionaries that would be available to the expanding migrant population. So there was really a call for missionaries to come to Mindanao. Next slide, please. Around this time, we actually, those of us who've done a bit of Mindanao church history, but the revolution in China, led by Mao Zedong, led to the expulsion of many religious congregations, which were foreign mission societies founded for the conversion of China. And since either they were forcibly ejected, expelled, or they had to live on their own. They didn't want to go back to Europe or North America, and so they wanted to stay around in Asia. And the best possibility was here in the Philippines. It's just nearby. Population is Catholic. Certain level of English is already spoken. And Mindanao was in dire need for missionaries. So it was this particular context then that brought the Colombans, the PMEs, the Sacred Heart, the Marinol, the OMIs, the Passionists, and a number of women religious congregations. And that's why in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the majority of missionaries in Mindanao were still foreigners from mainly Europe and North America. Next slide. So there, the map shows you that, very interesting because during the Spanish regime, the Dominicans and the Recollection, the Agustinians and the Franciscans and the Jesuits agreed who will go to which areas across the archipelago. Now, this was repeated again, even among the Protestants, they did that, who will go to Ilocos or go to Luzon and so on. When all these foreign missionary mission societies came to Mindanao, they also sort of agreed on who will go to which area. And that's why the Colombians are in the western part across what is Dopin now. The Sacred Heart went to Agusan, Surigao, Marinol across the Davao region, uh, mainly today Davao del Norte, Davao de Oro, and Davao del Norte Oriental. And then the rest, Davao del Sur, Davao City towards Davao Occidental, were the PME from Quebec, the Canadians. Passionists in South Cotabato. The Oblates took most of Cotabato and then across towards the Sulu archipelago. Next slide, please. Well, there were late arrivals later on, beyond the American occupation, of course, and the list was there. So when the foreign missionaries came here, the Colombans and the Marinol and so on and so forth, like some of the Jesuits who remained in the Mindanao, they were really mainly serving the needs of, of, of parishes that were rising, that were being established. And so these were already with the migrant settlers. Hardly anyone was really doing anything with the Lumad. Next slide, please. Then Vatican II came, 62 to 65, and I think most of us are familiar with Vatican II. There are no millennials in this crowd, no? So Vatican II brought about church adjournamento. It redefined the church's mission, its role in the world, service to the poor, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Vatican II has such a major impact in Mindanao because by then, well, of course, the whole Bishop Tudtud and dialogue of faith and life with the Moro people, we have that already. But in terms of the Lumad, the impact of the Mindanao Church was that it led to a few missionaries beginning to move to the uplands and to serve the Lumads. This would include the Passionists in South Cotabato, the Colombans in the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Marinolers in Davao, the PME in Davao, and the OMIs in Cotabato. Next slide, please. In the beginning, mostly the engagements were in the hope of being able to proselytize naturally because, I mean, we were just adjusting to the new missiological paradigms. But as they got more exposed to Lumad realities, a missiological shift took place. Next slide, please. Urgent issues were being confronted, whether you like it or not, even in the late 60s, 70s, when you were entering Lumad communities, you are confronted with the land issue. The dislocation from their ancestral domain was taking place. The security issues owing to harassment was taking place, especially after 1972 with martial law. Meanwhile, even if there was Panamin, government was neglecting Lumad territories. Hardly any budget allocated for school, health centers, infrastructure, and so on. And that's why poverty, disease, illiteracy, and so on were highest in Lumad communities, of course, among Moro communities too. Next slide, please. The early pastoral programs then were begun beyond just the catechism and the masses and the sacraments and so on. So some of them were beginning to do some legal action, tapping lawyers. Some were getting into adult literacy. Some were setting up health centers, but still highlighting Western type of medicine. Then there were scholars among the Lumad up to the level at least to high school. Some even established dormitory schools, very much like during the American occupation. Some were getting into income generating projects like handicrafts. But if you look at all of this, they were mainly dole out of the sense of charity. Next slide, please. However, they all realize year after year, no matter how much you did, that the situation remained the same. Problems persisted. And even in some areas, this really have worsened. Next slide, please. Following the convening of the 1967 Rural Congress, the CBCP set up the National Secretariat of Social Action, Justice, and Peace. And eventually, of course, Bishop Julio Labayan became the national director. But the main concern of the Rural Congress at this particular time, late 60s, post-Vatican II, were the poor, marginalized, landless peasants. Because the tenancy problem was really was a central issue of most Filipinos at this particular time. Next slide, please. Following the convening of the 1967 Rural Congress of the CBCP, the Mindanao bishops set up the Mindanao Sulu Secretariat of Social Action, or then known as MISAS. Eventually, of course, with Bishop Claver as one of the conveners, and he appointed Father Tamarti, a Marino priest, as the executive director. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, there was a very important, very interesting Lumad program that was arising in Lake Cebu. This was through Rex Mansman, a former Passionist priest. He's not a priest anymore. He set up the Santa Cruz Mission, which was an integral rural development program. I knew this very well because I was regional manager of PBSP Mindanao, and I went there regularly because we had partnerships in terms of funding, in terms of technical programs, and it was used at the hospital. They have schools, they had all kinds of agricultural projects. It was really very interesting and very comprehensive. Next slide, please. As the situation in Mindanao was a little different, considering that we have more and Lumad communities here, unlike the National NASA, the Secretariat under the National Secretariat of Social Action, NISAS did not just concentrate on the peasant issues, but they began to be very interested in the land issue, the security issue, government neglect, and the problems of the Lumad communities. Next slide. Out of this came a very strong interest to bring people together into a Lumad forum. And this was organized in Lake Cebu, spearheaded by Father Rex. And this was to discuss issues impacting lives of indigenous people, how they were responding at that particular time, weaknesses, limitations, strengths, and how to network in Mindanao so that there can be collaborative efforts. This led, or this gave birth to the Mindanao Sulu Forum on Cultural Communities, which unfortunately is not there anymore. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, the Mindanao Sulu bishops began to realize that there was a need to respond to the challenge of Vatican II as local church, where they needed to have a forum of ideas and communion of churches. Next slide, please. So Mindanao Sulu Church in the 1960s, fortunately, had very progressive bishops who were oriented to Vatican II, the likes of Bishop Tudtud, Morelos, Varela, Claver, and others. And they led the Mindanao Sulu Church in the Adjournamento movement. Next slide, please. There were other reasons why the Mindanao Sulu Church was more ready to implement Vatican II. Population here constituted by migrants is a young population. There's a major presence of many men and women religious congregations, the Columban Sisters, Marino Sisters, the MSC, OMI, and so on and so on and so forth. there were already some ordinations, mainly from San Jose and San Carlos seminaries. And we had a young diocesan clergy by the 1970s who were already providing input about Vatican II decrees. Even if there are multi-languages across Mindanao, somehow with Cebuano, Bisaya, it's possible to some level to communicate with each other, because naturally we cannot speak English when we are with ordinary people from our parishes. And of course, if you look at the geographic character of Mindanao, you compare it especially to the Visayas, despite limitations in terms of road and bridges and infrastructure, there's a lot more accessibility to each other. So these were factors why when Vatican II, or when the bishops began to be interested to echo the Acts and Decrees of Vatican II and was presented at CBCP, the whole CBCP did not really get warm to the idea. But it was the Mindanao bishop said that if they don't want it, we can do it in Mindanao, and thus was born the Mindanao Sulu Pastoral Conference. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So they gave birth to Mindanao Sulu Pastoral Conference. The first three ones came one after the other after every 3 years. Previous slide, please. Previous slide. Okay. First one was in Davao City in 71. Second was in Cagayan de Oro 74. Not finished yet. Previous slide, please. The third was in Osamis. After MSPC 1, the bishops thought that the continuity of the recommendations implementation of MSPC 1 would sort of go to waste, gone with the wind, if there was really no one to follow this up. So a secretariat was established, and they appointed Father Sampaico, SJ, the late Father Sampaico, as executive director. So a secretary was also born. Next slide, please. If you look quickly at the matrix, you have an idea of where it happened, when it happened, who were the bishops in charge of that conference, and the priorities then. And you can tell at the last column, priorities, what sort of ministries were being privileged from the first to the third. Like leadership, catechism, socializing Catholic schools, and media for the first. They added youth to the second. And then cultural communities came in very strongly in the Osamis. The Moro concern already, of course, came up in the second, although in the first there was some discussion of it. But the Lumad came on the third. This was the conference where the bishops appointed Bishop Tudtud as chair of the MSPC board and Bishop Scaler as his co-chair. And of course, all of this was within the context of building BCC. It was then known as Basic Christian Communities, not BEC. And the themes were building BCC, self-nourishing, sustaining, governing. And the third one, because this was already martial law, building Christian communities towards justice and love. Next slide, please. I'm going very fast now because I think my time is almost up. Next slide. At MSPC 3, so Bishop Tudtud, Bishop Scaler were elected as members of the board. Previous slide. Previous slide, please. Okay. This is the only photo I have where I am with Bishop Tudtud and Bishop Scaler, because then, we didn't have cell phones then where you can just take photos everywhere. It was very expensive to have photos. Anyway, so I was also elected as the executive secretary of the secretariat. So I worked very closely with both of them, with both Bishop Tudtud and Bishop Scaler. The other guy there in the photograph is Father Karl, who, as you know, is one of the major peace dialogue advocates in Mindanao. Next slide, please. Next slide. So it was really around this time when I really got to know Bishop Tudtud more, spent a lot of time with him in Marawi. We traveled a lot together, had all kinds of meetings. So he, as chair of the MSPC board, and us, because we were a big group in the secretariat. We were about 25, although not everyone was into Lumad. No, some were in elections, some were in health programs, I mean relief and rehabilitation, and so on. So the staff, along with him, and of course Bishop Scalia every now and then, we develop programs because cultural communities, it was known them as cultural communities, not IPs, was already a priority. So we expanded on the network of the IP ministry. We targeted that all dioceses across Mindanao should have a desk because there are IPs practically in all dioceses in Mindanao. Then some of us visited these communities to find out what's really happening there. We assisted them in seeking outside funding because it was easier then to ask for funding abroad. And we held consultations, forum meetings to discuss issues. We documented these issues and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. The impact of the urgent issues at that particular time was also extending because imagine this is martial law, 74 to 76, when Bishop Tudtud and I were directly involved in the running of the secretariat. Panamin was becoming even more abusive. Human rights violations were expanding. There were food blockades in parts of Davao del Norte. They were proposing dams like in Lake Cebu, echoing the one of the Chico Dam River in the Cordillera. Oil palm plantations were beginning in Agusan, dislocating the Banwao and the Manubo communities there. And more dislocations were taking place, incursions into the IP communities, leading to a loss of their cultural identity. So these were some of the issues we were dealing with. Next slide, please. By mid-1970s, it became clear that the issues impacting Lumad communities were also interrelated with those of the Moro people, and these were very much linked to justice and development issues. Next slide. Given this, there was a movement, and this was very ecumenical, by the way. To respond to these related issues, a group of religious leaders, Moro, Lumad, and Christians, Catholics, and Protestants, set up the Mindanao Sulu Conference on Justice and Development. The key people here were Bishop Claver, Sean McDonough, the Colombian, because of course both of them are anthropologists. And there were all kinds of meetings and fora to bring people together in a very ecumenical setting. Next slide, please. So the major activities were we're beginning to network the Lumad community because we realize we cannot always be the voice of the Lumad people. Eventually, they have to voice their own voices. They have to be the ones to be speaking out and telling the state, the government, the military, what is it that they really were resisting. So the MCGAD established what they call the Silingang Dapit or SILDAP, where we clustered them together. And then, of course, with the Moro, dealing with the rebellion, and that led to the Interfaith Dialogue conferences. We also had all kinds of very specialized conferences, like the Worldview Conference, in order for us to have an anthropological understanding of the Lumad identity. Next slide, please. That's the SILDAP. That's the Siligang Dapit. So the Lumads of the by the way, this time there were already these sub-regions in Mindanao that were also introduced in MSPC. So in the Sambasuli region, the Subanon and other IPs, they were grouped together. In the Bukidnon, Cagayan de Oro, the same. In the Stab region, in the Ditama region, Kidmaco. This facilitated bringing together IPs, and you cut down on expenses, and even language is considered, and so on and so forth. And this was very effective, even beyond years, and even until today, there are still remnants of the SILDAP operating. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, other dioceses, especially in Luzon, in various isolated parts of the Visayas were asking, what about us? Because they have had their own initiatives in these particular areas dealing with IPs. Next slide. You recall that one of the major issues that really erupted during martial law was the dam project, the Chico Dam project, uh, which would have impacted on the Kalingas. And because the Kalingas resisted, led by Maclean Dulag, he was killed, he was assassinated. And that became a major, big issue. And this got tackled by the national IP movement in the 70s, owing to the government's aggressive plan for energy exploration and mining. The memory of Maclean Dulag has remained very strong until today in the Cordilleras. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so by the mid-1970s, it became clear that the IP issues across the country needed a nationwide collaborative action. Thus, the CBCP called for a national assembly that would lead to the setting up of the Episcopal Commission on the Indigenous People, although earlier it was still known as the Episcopal Commission on Tribal Filipinos. Next slide, please. Well, there's politics in names, and that's why I think Bishop Tudtud was very aware of this when he took over as the first chair of the Episcopal Commission. We were earlier known as Indios, as pagan tribes, as uncivilized. American occupation referred to them as non-Christian tribes. Then we use words like natives, uplanders. Later on, during the Republic, they were already referred to as cultural minorities. That's why Panamin is from that word. To soften a bit of the pejorative term of cultural minorities, they changed it to cultural communities. And this is what is inserted in the IPRA law. Bishop Tudtud, in that first of the assembly, said there's something wrong here about the terminologies. And so the assembly discussed what would be the better way, a politically correct way in referring to our Lumad brothers and sisters. You have to use English. And so they thought that the best term would be tribal Filipinos. There's Filipinos, but they're distinctly different from us because they have held on to their tribal traditions. It was only later, of course, that tribal Filipinos also gave way to indigenous peoples. But for a long while, the beginning of the Episcopal Commission, it was known as ECTF, Episcopal Commission for Tribal Filipinos. Next slide, please. In one of the ECTF meetings, the participants, with the late Bishop Tudtud as chair of the commission, thought of having an Indigenous Sunday celebration. They proposed this idea, and the bishop members of the ECTF brought this to the CBCP Assembly for discussion. Next slide, please. In the July 1978 Assembly, the CBCP bishops decided that every second Sunday of October would be celebrated as IP Sunday. On October 8, 1978, the first IP Sunday was celebrated across the country, and henceforth, all parishes would set aside the second Sunday of October as Indigenous Peoples Sunday. This month, we had it last October 11. Next slide, please. Eventually, the United Nations took up the global IP situation and named them Indigenous Peoples, and eventually ECTF gave way to ECIP. And as ECIP continued its advocacy, especially related to the land issue. Next slide, please. Then something happened on the 26th of June in 1987. On its way to Baguio City, a plane crashed. Among the passengers, the late Bishop Bienvenido Tudtud of Marawi. Very sad. We all felt very sad that day. Next slide, please. Bishop Tutu's legacy to popularize concern, commitment to serve the indigenous peoples has been sustained through the years until today. Globally, the IP issues even has expanded. Next slide. The United Nations General Assembly 45164 of 10 December 1990 proclaimed 1992 as the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. And the decade then became the UN Decade for Indigenous Peoples. And until today, of course, the United Nations have stopped really promoting the IPs. The activities of the ECIP Secretariat and the staff and the network throughout the country have been sustained in terms of supporting the struggles of the indigenous people. And the ECIP convention takes place regularly, practically every year, where they bring together all the diocesan IP ministries, priests, religious lay people, including Lumad leaders themselves. Next slide, please. After long decades of struggles, finally the 1987 Constitution under the presidency of Mrs. Aquino included provision for ancestral land domain. Because before that, the 1935 Constitution, the 1972 Constitution only categorized land as public land and private land. But the 1987, owing to the campaign and the lobbying and all the action done through the years, a third category of land was approved constitutionally. So now we have a category of ancestral land and ancestral domain. Next slide, please. From 1987 to 93, there were demonstrations, prayer rallies, prayer conferences to pressure Mrs. Aquino's government to deal with the 1987 provision granting rights on ancestral domain. Congress, however, we all know they're all landowners, or most of them are, did not act on the provision of the Constitution. So up to 1996, there was no law to make sure that ancestral domain can be implemented. Next slide, please. That's why in the interim, Attorney Fulgencio Factoran, former human rights lawyer, under flag with Senator Jokno, was appointed by Cory as secretary of the DNR. And because there was no law, instead he issued a departmental order number 2, series of 93, granting indigenous peoples the certificate of ancestral domain claim. It's just a claim in lieu of the title. And the ACIP then assisted many communities apply for this in the interim. Next, please. From 1993 to 96, more rallies and fora to pressure Congress to pass a law. The ACIP plus other NGOs like the PANDIPI, the KSK-LRC, the LSU team, and many others joined forces to support the indigenous peoples who were marching in the streets demanding that the law be passed. Next slide, please. Finally, 10 years later, after the 1987 Constitution, under the term of President Fidel Ramos, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or IPRA, Republic Act 8371, was passed, now granting the Certificate of Ancestral Domain title to those applying for this. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the IPRA's implementation has been faced with all kinds of obstacles. One is due to the Philippine Mining Act of 1995. As we're sitting here, there's a drama unfolding in South Cotabato, in Tampakan, because of the Sagittarius mines. And the Diocese of Marbel, that has been strongly on the side of the Lumad resisting this mining, are now in a quandary because the NCIP has already granted the new owners of this mining firm the go signal to operate their open pit mining. And that shows you that despite IPRA, problems have persisted. Next slide, please. After 1995, expansion of mining firms, but there continues to be rallies, and especially because there have been a lot more militarization and human rights violations in areas where there are explorations or actual operations already of mining firms. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, IP Sundays continue, and very interesting the themes from the past years. Just some samples here. You can tell that the IP agenda has been very closely monitoring on the realities of the IPs. In 2008, renewing commitment to Indigenous peoples' self-determination. Following year, the Church and Indigenous peoples reflecting on the whole reality. Then, 2010, healing for solidarity, asking forgiveness for sins on behalf of the indigenous peoples. And next slide, some of the things that they have come out in terms of statement will show you that so in the 27th in 2009, they declared that integral evangelization with the IPs is witnessing to the gospel of Jesus. We respect human dignity, uphold their rights to their ancestral domain and their cultural identity, and we commit ourselves to enter into interfaith dialogue with the IPs who are holding on to their traditional belief systems. Next slide, please. Facilitating culturation, engage in ecumenical dialogue, heed the imperative of immersion in our dialogue of life with the IPs, support them in their self-determination and genuine empowerment, appreciate and affirm the creation spirituality of the IPs, and journey with them as children of the one God. Next slide. Okay, the ECI Bishops Commission has sustained the legacy of Bishop Tudtud. Unfortunately, globally at the Universal Church, we have a main model for pastors today, who's none other than Pope Francis. The recent Amazonia Synod shows us just how deep is the Pope's concern for indigenous peoples. Next slide. And that's the end. Daghang salamat. Deep gratitude to Tatay Bido. May hapon sa tanan. Sorry, I talked more than 30 minutes.
No problem, Brother Karl. That was really, really comprehensive. And yet at the same time, it's like, what is this? A short course on history of the indigenous peoples. Friends, you will see at the bottom right, down there corner of your sa Zoom, you find the reactions. Since we cannot all together clap our hands and speak, you can just press the reactions to clap our hands for Brother Karl. Can we do all that together, please? Your buttons there for clap, I have pressed mine. So those who are not familiar, if you find that, just show that. So once again, Brother Karl, thank you very, very much. And before we go to the open forum, while you formulate your thoughts, your questions, and before I read some of the messages in the chat box, I'd like to call in Father Rex Rocamora, a very active convener of this webinar. I was supposed to call Father Rex, after the prayer. I think I got carried away and I wanted to introduce Brother Karl right away. So Father Rex, could you please give us the, brief rationale and objectives for this series of symposia? Brother Rex, we call you now while our friends are still formulating their thoughts and their questions. And before I read some of these comments in the chat box.
Daghang salamat, Brother Karl.
Pa yan.
Oh, mauna to. Unsay gihimo nimo, you reconnected us way beyond like in my imagination. You really reconnected us to the story, from the beginning, Spanish time, tapos Revolution period, and then the American time, martial law era until today. So really, this Remembering Tatay Bido Symposium is trying to get to know Tatay Bido as our inspiration for the dialogue of life and faith. Last symposium, we had Sean McDonough, and he, in a way, broadened the context of the dialogue of life. Not only people like us, but also the ecological life. And today also, you have reconnected us to the story, no? In remembering not only Tatay Bido, no? But you have given a very, very broad context. Salamat yun kayo. Kinahanglan ako mag-review gyud ani o magtuon. Kay abinako sa una, si Tatay Bido, sa Christian-Muslim dialogue lang. But this is the year of ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, and then indigenous peoples. How can we connect him to the indigenous peoples? Out of my ignorance. Salamat kayo because of your writing, that an information coming from you, that in fact, he was very much central, like he introduced the indigenous people's Sunday celebration. And anyway, I just highlight the word remembering, reconnecting, because of our situation now. There's a lot of misery due to disconnection. Not only the lockdown, but our disconnection from the land, from the history, from nature, from God. You know. So this is a very inspiring talk. Daghang salamat. Pwede ba ni makuan? Ma-access ba ang imong PowerPoint?
Yeah, you have a copy at your
Yes.
end, so maybe Arlene can just forward it to you.
What I mean, can we post it somewhere also so that more people can have access?
Well, depende ninyo. Use it in whatever way you can. There's no copyright.
At least in the Tatay Bido friends, you know, there's a place there where we can put it there. Yeah. So daghan kaayong salamat yun na matugkad niya akong gibati ron.
Okay.
And you have reconnected us. Salamat. Malayo na mi sa sa depression. Ang tambal daw aning mga problema karon is connection. So you really brought us back to, you know, to the story. Thank you.
Amen. Salamat kaayo. Thank you very much, Father Rex, for that. No, before we get more comments, no, Brother Karl, there's one question here in the chat box, and medyo taas-taas ni siya, Brother Karl, but let me read this to you. It says here, from CBCP ECEA, Robert Sampson, and he said, I know we have legislations to protect our IPs that you have just even presented, yet these laws seem not executed or neither implemented. What do we need to do as interagency organizations working together to encourage the government to give priority to these laws that protect our IPs and their environment so as to sanction these laws to the fullest? Do we need always a senator or a congressman, mayor or governor to sponsor or take this as their advocacy? What can we do concretely to create more awareness, to support and help our IPs, especially in preserving their cultures and traditions, or even to change the way they are stereotyped as cave dwellers, dirty, or smelly people? There's a lot there, Brother Karl. So I don't know how you would attack. Taas yung kayo, no? So
in the loop now is Tony Aboso. And if you don't know Tony Aboso, he is a long-time Secretary General of the Episcopal Commission of Indigenous People. In fact, today, even if he's a layperson, he is the one, I don't know what's the official title, but he represents the Episcopal Commission within the CBCP. And Tony would be able to also respond to that. I don't know if Tony would be willing to do that because that kind of a question does need a few more people to say their piece. But my take on the question and my response would be this, that there are variations of what can be done. In fact, before the lockdown, we've had really very interesting meetings with the ACIP. I was very privileged to be invited in practically most of the meetings in preparation for the theme this year and in view of the 2021 commemoration. And part of what we were discussing among the members of the ACIP and some of the staff of the Secretariat was how we can redeem some of the initiatives that were done by ACIP and other related NGOs that were campaigning for the approval of IPRA. Because there was a time we really were banking on IPRA as one major way to solve some of the problems faced by the indigenous people, especially in terms of their dislocation for the ancestral domain. But it's not only, the law itself does not really just focus on the land issue. It's very comprehensive. It also deals with education and health, cultural identity, and so on and so forth. So the law itself is even if there are certain limitations still there, as and this is the problem with the Philippines. We have really nice laws as they are textualized, but it's always in the implementation that there are limitations. Anyway, so we have agreed because there have been many studies saying that instead of successes, there have been more failures and limitations in the implementation of IPRA. Part of that are just some of the limitations of the NCIP, both at the national level and at the regional level. But there is also something very crucial here in regard to how the state is really not fully supporting it. In fact, for example, in terms of funding to NCIP is very small, let alone which goes directly to the indigenous people. So we were proposing that just like there's a bishop businessman forum, there can be a possibility of bringing the Episcopal Commission and other bishops interested in this to have a dialogue with key people in government and especially the NCIP top leadership to review IPRA and then to assess where it is based on data on the ground because you can have access to the research that's indicating where the inefficiencies are. Unfortunately, under Duterte, apparently there are not so many possibilities by which this can be done at the top level. So ways can be done at lower levels, at a regional level where there's greater possibility by which the local bishops could do this. So this is one. Because I think people are also tired of just rallies and demonstrations and so on and so on and so forth. Because number one, there's a problem. And the one of Tampakan right now is a very good case study because the Blaan community is split. There are those that are fully supportive of the NCIP and the mining firm, and they're saying, go ahead with the mining. Even if they know that some of their own relatives are on the other side, along with the civil society organizations, including the Diocese of Marbel, that have long resisted the introduction of open pit mining. But part of really the reason why the Blaans are in favor is because of the whole development scheme. They're being promised schools, hospitals, jobs, employment, percentage of the wealth. And within the short-term needs of the Blaans, you understand why they would want to have those sort of benefits. Because for so long, they have been neglected. No one have assisted them in terms of their livelihood and so on. So anyway, so there are ways by which this can be done. And of course, one more I would like to say is, of course, the whole education. The ordinary Filipino non-Lumad's attitude is really one of almost racism. Una Paredes, a very distinguished anthropologist who comes from Misamis Oriental, wrote a paper on this, that the manner in which majority Filipinos who are non-interested in Lumad issues view them almost from a racist perspective. Using Libinas, it's really othering them, and that has really persisted. So how we are able through our school system, that's why the CEAP should be at the forefront of this, our Catholic schools should be at the forefront of this. And of course, if IPRA was to be implemented, the National Commission of Culture and Arts also should be on board. There can be something done in the whole educational system will make us better appreciate, indigenous knowledge, skills, practices, and spiritualities of our ancestors, especially as these are very relevant in view of climate change, including even the impact of COVID-19. That's all I can say at this moment.
Wow. Thank you so much, Brother Carl. Wow, I can't help but be amazed, at how you respond to these things. May I call in Tony Abuso? He might have something to say since you have called him. Yes,
Yes.
yes, Brother Tony.
Magandang hapon po sa lahat. Actually, yung sinabi po ni Brother Karl, encapsulated na eh. Hindi na kailangan pang dagdagan dahil kung sino man ang may authority na pagdating sa issue ng IPs and Lumad, si Brother Karl yon. Pero anyway, ang isa lang pong ginagawa ng ECIP sa ngayon, dahil hindi nga natin pwedeng asahan ng IPRA, ang implementasyon ng IPRA, ay patuloy pa rin yung ginagawa nating engagement with other government agencies. Talagang continuous na pinupush sila na ito ang batas para sa katutubo. At the same time, gusto rin nating maging batas din or maging ma-ratify ng Senado ang isang tratado, yung International Labor Organization Convention 169, na pwedeng maging sandata pa rin ng mga katutubo. Pero ang problema pa rin ito, paano i-implement ang gobyerno? So siguro hindi natin dapat tigilan yung engagement eh. Kasi kung mawawala yung engagement, lalong mawawala yung karapatan ng katutubo na i-push yung kanilang karapatan. So kailangan lagi talagang ang simbahan, ang mga suportang grupo ay nasa likod ng katutubo nang sa ganun hindi maiwanan at hindi kailangan talaga ang suporta ng mas maraming sektor, mas maraming grupo para talagang igiit sa pamahalaan o sino mang gobyerno ang nandyan na talagang tingnan kung ano ang gusto ng katutubo. Hindi yung gusto natin o yung gusto ng nasa taas. Kung ano yung gusto ng katutubo na karapat-dapat at sila yung magdidetermine. Kaya sabi nga ni Brother Karl kanina, napakalinaw na ang talagang pinupunto ng ECIP for the past 2 decades ay yung ang tinatawag na self-determination o sariling pagpapasya. Na sila ang magdikta kung anong development ang gusto nila. At ngayon, doon sa isang statement namin nakaraang linggo, na sinasabi na bigyan ng pagkakataon at talagang wag nang questionin na pag sinabi ng IP communities na no, makinig tayo, wag na tayong pumilit. Kasi yung sinasabi kanina ng pagbibigay ng certificate precondition ng NCIP doon sa tampakan, ay mukhang hindi na masasabing tama kasi nagsalita na yung mga katutubo, ayaw nila, pero nung hindi na-aprobahan, naglumipas lang ilang panahon, nagkaroon na naman uli ng konsultasyon, hindi gano'n ang consent eh. Kung sinabi ng katutubong ayaw nila, din natin yun. Ang problema, pinipilit natin o pinipilit ng pamahalaan yung gusto nilang klase ng development. So, hindi talaga nagkakaigi ang dalawang panig. Pero ang mahalaga dito, kung katutubong usapin, katutubo ang magpasya. So, marami pong salamat.
Maraming salamat po, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Katutubo ang sila talaga ang magpapasya. Na? Bottoms up instead of top down. Okay, nagbigay na ng clap sign at saka thumbs up si Brother Robert Samson. I acknowledge the presence also of Bishop Emeritus Tony Ledesma. So I wonder if Archbishop Tony would have something to say, given the fact that his episcopacy has been connected with peace and development, interreligious dialogue, and that includes also the indigenous peoples. Bishop?
Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to congratulate Brother Karl Gaspar for a comprehensive presentation of the situation of the IPs, and also Tony Abuso for his continuing concern with the ECIP about the situation today. No? Yung last March 3, before the COVID lockdown in Butuan, there was actually some kind of a national consultation of, I think about 8 bishops came, 2 or 3 from Luzon, majority from Mindanao, including Bishop Edwin de la Peña, Bishop Almedilla, Bishop Dael, myself, I think Bishop Ochimar, and some others. But that was also a meeting of some of the Lumad leaders in the Caraga region and also from other parts of Mindanao. So the bishops were listening to the datus, and also a number of the concerns have been raised already by the presentation of Brother Karl. But I recall that part of the current situation is really also the peace and order situation caused about by the continuing conflict between NPA on the one side and the military on the other side. And apparently the Lumad community is caught in between. So I think that is one challenge, how we can also help the Lumad communities to be self-governing and self-sustaining. And part of the situation there is also the incursion of mining interests and possibly other agro-industrial interests. So first of all, I think the challenges would be something like from the side of the IPs themselves. There is need for good governance. It's not clear that the local leaders of the IPs at this time are all what would be called authentic or genuine leaders. Even among themselves, there seems to be some kind of division. And that has been aggravated by the conflict between the NPA and the military. There are killings on both sides, and certainly it is something where the church groups are also caught in between. There have been attempts of setting up schools for the Lumad in the remote areas, and I think that is still a continuing challenge. But maybe one reflection I have is, first of all, the population. Brother Karl pointed out that there is some kind of lack of clarity as to the total population of the IPs, from ranging from 1 to 5 or even 10 million. On the other hand, when we look at the CAD-C or the CAD-T grants now, we can also calculate that the Lumad communities are given a scope of maybe from anywhere from 100 to 1,000 or even 10,000 hectares. So there is a lot of land resources. In one sense, the IP communities are given a lot of natural resources, but the challenge is really how to develop these resources. Very similar to what happened with the grain reform, that you just give the land to small farmers, but if they are not also given the resources or the capability to develop the land, they will still remain in poverty. So I think that is part of the challenge of the church, that we can also see how we can help in the development of these resources without the IPs losing their rights to the land or their claim to their ancestral domain. So I leave that as a continuing challenge. One kind of approach we're trying to explore now in Cagayan de Oro is the idea of inclusive business, where through contract growing, maybe local Lumad communities can be helped by also agro-industrial corporations that tie up with them through contract growing, where contain, they retain the ownership of their land, but on the other hand, they also get the benefits of a market outlet of technology and management skills. And that is something that is still ongoing. It has been done in some places now in Bukidnon, and hopefully it is one kind of arrangement that can be of help to the IPs on the one hand and also to the surrounding communities on the other hand. So maybe that is just some observations I'd like to share with the group now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bishop Tony, for your very insightful remarks and assertions. No? I think Mindanao is also blessed at the moment to have a good set of bishops also, including Bishop Alan Casica's brother Karl, of course,
Yeah,
our
certainly.
former special mention, former
He's
professor.
in he's in
Yes,
hot
hot seat,
waters.
hot waters. And I think in relation to the church, I would like to acknowledge, Brother Carl, that you have been teaching about the indigenous peoples in various seminaries, including St. John Vianney Theological Seminary. And so the different seminaries and the different church agencies also take the cue, from people like you and the NCIP, ECIP. Bishop Edwin, do you have something to say in addition to what Bishop Tony had mentioned, given the fact that you were part also of the meeting in Butuan? Because there's the two of you here. Just unmute.
Okay, I have to unmute. Okay. Yes, that was the first activity where the three commissions in charge of organizing the year of ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, and indigenous peoples collaborated in order to make that event successful. Our dialogue with the religious leaders of the indigenous peoples, and that was a beautiful experience for us. And also it opened us to the possibilities, the great possibilities of inclusive liturgy, something like making our liturgy something relevant to our indigenous peoples, considering that some of them are also already Catholics, no? And so enculturation in the liturgy should be promoted now. And also there has been, there are so many issues confronting the indigenous peoples, especially in regard to their rights and regarding land ownership, no? And one of those issues has something to do with the Kaliwa Dam, no? And I do not know exactly what is the development, what are the updates regarding that project, because the IP communities in the Sierra Madre had been really working hard to oppose that plan, and it seems like their voice has not always been heard by the government, no. But this is something that we can work together, and perhaps the indigenous people someday, it should be a good opportunity for us to educate our Christians regarding issues related to the indigenous people, so that really we are made aware that there has to be a concerted effort on the part of the church, no, to support the cause of the indigenous peoples, no. Who will fight for them, no? And that is our challenge as a church.
Thank you very much, Bishop Edwin. And we'd like to thank also Mr. Samson for giving us a very comprehensive question that took 4 people to answer or to respond to. I think we only have time for maybe one more question or comment from any of our participants. We don't have time anymore to call everybody. I think the present count is 74. It may be acknowledged later by Father Rex or by Professor Bong in another platform. Maybe not here because we don't have time.
Yeah, Venus, maybe
yes.
we can have the brief comment and reflection from Dr. Castro, Ma'am Doretta Castro, if you can have a brief
yeah,
comment.
that's right. Yes, that's right. I may message dito si Professor Castro. Congratulations to Brother Karl. Great presentation. I also appreciated Archbishop Tony's inputs. Thanks to you both. Yes, Madam Castro, you might want to say a little more, to expound a little more about this afternoon's webinar.
Well, sorry that my connectivity is really not that good, so I just unmuted myself.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say that I am grateful that I I attended because I think it really broadened my understanding of the concerns of the indigenous peoples. And I hope that as an educator, I can perhaps do a bit more, you know, in enlightening young people about this. We have been, as an educator, I have been very active with building friendships between Muslims and Christians, students, like we have a twinning project with Cotabato, Muslims who are living in North Cotabato. But really, I realize now that we have not given that much attention to the plight of the indigenous peoples. So that's just a short input. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Castro, for your affirmations. We don't have so much time, but I think we have time for another one. Perhaps Sister Esper, can we hear from you if you're still here for your own reflection? You have been affirming Brother Karl's presentation. You said Brother Karl sharing amazed me. So would you like to share a little more? Sister Esper, are you still here? Because she commented here
Hey.
that, there she is. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome. Fine, good morning.
Actually, it's a review from Brad Karl's lecture because I have been his student in anthropology.
Wow, ayan.
so I was now renewed, and I'm really sad because of this situation that the NCIP, as an agency for IPs, is now opening for mining, no? Mining permits. So it's very parang opposite, no, to their role to protect the IPs. And I can see that also the IPs lack of leadership as a common, no, parang unlike with the Muslims, they have this leadership, for example, mga professionals that had been their voices to the upper ups, authorities. But then the Lumads, they need to have these leaders to unite themselves in order that their voice could be heard. No? So this is the need of the Lumad communities. Then they really have to unite themselves in order to have one voice and leadership that they could voice out, no? And the church really had to push them.
Okay, thank you very much, sister. Thank you very much for this great observation. Kaswerte ba nimo, estudyante ka ni Brother Karl? Professor Bong, let me just take this opportunity lang to call, we have young pupils, not pupils, young students here. Your students and maybe our seminarians also. I wonder if our young people would have something to say, since really this crusade, no, this mission would really fall in their hands. Mga tigulang naman kadagara nato, no? So I think if we can hear a response from the younger people, whether seminarians or, in fact, we have a seminarian. I think we have two coming from Bukidnon, no? So I don't know if they will have something to say also. You didn't have the chance to be Brother Karl's students. That's why we let you join this webinar. So anybody or from the students of Professor Bong, just unmute yourselves if you wish to say something, or maybe kaninga hisgotanan, maybe very alien to some of you, but maybe just to kind of hear from you regarding your comments, your insights, or kahit feelings na lang, no, about Brother Carl's presentation, or what you know about the IPs. Brother Robert, are you about to say something? Okay, here's
Yes.
Robert Angelo is our a Galilee year seminarian from St. John Vianney Seminary from Bukidnon, Don Carlos.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm a seminarian from St. John Vianney. So I met for a couple of times with Brother Karl, when he went here to Vianney, and also during our Madaris volunteer program under Ateneo de Davao training. He gave us a talk on the engagement with the Muslims. First of all, I'd like to appreciate and really commend Brother Karl for that very nice presentation, and so with other reactors. Siguro I would just like to share two concrete experiences that somehow echoes our or the rationale of this program. First, in 2017 and 2018, I was assigned to Cabanglasan, Bukidnon. No, I taught in Father Leone Memorial School and lived with the Jesuits. And I was also one of the dorm managers of their Lumad scholars. So I had a year of exposure with them. And hearing the presentation, I really can echo from the side no na really the communication with the young, especially with the Lumads, is very vital, no? Especially with the young Lumads, the students there in Cabanglasan. And also with on my second personal experience, last year I was assigned in Basilan. Three of us seminarians from St. John Vianney were assigned to Basilan to engage as a volunteer teacher for elementary pupils. I was assigned in Lamitan City. And there is a personal reflection, as what Mambi said, the role of the young people, no? Especially those who have the power to speak up, like us who has educational backgrounds, who are siguro brave enough to really face, to be in a strange place, no, like that of Basilan, because I mean, I never imagined myself to be in that place. Siguro in a year of dialogue, it was a year of dialogue and encounter with the Muslims and with the IPs as well. It challenged me really that there are many disparities, not just in religion but even in history. No, and as young people, we are really challenged to bridge that gap. No, our mere presence, even just as volunteer teachers, really helped a lot. And personally, it removed my biases against the Muslims and as well as the Lumads. No, so I just hope that some people would really hear this kind of thing. No, some many millennials would hear this kind of seminars or webinars, because this would really make an impact, no, in the future. And siguro that's my a penny for my thought. Na personally, I am very challenged, and so as young people, millennials, to connect and to dialogue with the IPs and as well as with the other religions, particularly the Muslims.
Thank you very much. Well said, Brother Robert. So, much as I would want to continue, and lami kaayo magpadayon ani kay very interesting yun ang hisgotanan. We have to wrap up, no? Ipapahulay na nato si Brother Karl kang uban natong mga senior citizens. Joke lang, brother, ha? Anyway, for takeaways and recommendations, no? We have somebody we would like to call in. He is a Russell Berry Fellow, faculty member of the Institute of Religion, University of Santo Tomas. Let's hear from Professor Philip Fuentes. If Professor Fuentes is still around. Okay,
hello, good
thank
afternoon.
you.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear, but we can see you po.
Yes, my camera has a problem. So sorry for that.
Okay, sige na lang.
So my face is not important in a way.
Yes, what you say is more important.
Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, and thank you for this privilege and honor to be invited in this symposium in honor of Tatay Bido, a man of dialogue, with the theme Tatay Bido and Lumad Ministry in Mindanao by Brother Carlito M. Gaspar. So allow me to thank and congratulate our esteemed speaker for a very thought-provoking, straightforward, but honest account of the historical, political, theological experience of our brethren, the indigenous people. Taking a cue from Brother Gaspar's talk, it is safe to say that the underlying truth to our endeavor on the promotion of the rights and well-being of our IP brethren, particularly in our theologization, is based on the idea that we all share in the historical cultural heritage of our brethren by common history, particularly before the period of colonization. Having this in mind, it is understandable why it is not only the civil societies that are at the forefront of this endeavor by way of advocacies, but also the various religious traditions, particularly the Catholic Church. It was highlighted that there are increasing religious initiatives that take as their that are taken as their advocacy to promote the basic rights of the indigenous people. At this juncture, allow me to underline my takeaways in today's proceedings. First, there is a need to undertake the historical account of the IPs to have an appropriate response to their immediate and pressing needs. Accordingly, the encounter between the colonizers and the colonized is one that is asymmetrical, since the colonizers subjugated the colonized. It is, however, noteworthy that the said encounter is a two-way process as both sides tried to navigate the challenges posed by their circumstances, thereby experiencing some sort of transformation. It is therefore a mistake to assume that it was only the side of colonized who were transformed by their colonizers. We can say that the church's ongoing reframing or redoing of theology is a testament to the significant contribution of such an encounter. Second, the aftermath of such an encounter resulted in the idea of of indigenous peoples. Likewise, since the encounter occurred in variations as several colonizers tried to propagate their missionary activities, their Christian identities were colored by their respective colonizing evangelizers. As Brother Gaspar opines, the whole power dynamics in which Christianity was introduced colored how the conversion process unfolded. Third, while there were angst and fear on the part of the natives for seemingly turning away from their indigenous belief system, they nonetheless played a significant role in the propagation of Christianity in the archipelago. With the increasing number of converts, so also the need for more missionaries. So this is manifested in the number of missionary congregations present in the country right now. Fourth, the missionaries' decoding and translating of the Bible into the various languages of the natives facilitated the literacy development of the natives. In turn, the missionaries' learning of the culture and language of the natives enabled them to enter into the culture and psyche of the natives. Fifth, a watershed moment happened in the missionary or evangelizing enterprise when the Catholic Church convened the Vatican Council II, that which paved the way for a paradigm and attitudinal shifts in doing mission and evangelization. Thus, the introduction of the ideas such as inculturation, interreligious dialogue, and intercultural dialogue is a far cry from the old paradigm of proselytism. Sixth, it was highlighted that the forces that catalyzed the recognition of the rights of our IP brethren, both at the international and national levels, in the forms of decrees, declarations, and legislation of laws were the agencies at the grassroots level. It is understandable considering that they are the ones who witnessed and experienced the plight of the indigenous people. The Church would later on embrace the movement as inspired by the call and spirit of Vatican II, which is instrumental in her being at the forefront of promoting the rights and well-being of the IPs. A sense of solidarity with our IP brethren is manifested in this newfound encounter. 7. Despite the persistence and enduring commitment of the Church and other agencies to social justice and pastoral problems, Brother Gaspar informs us that the situation remains the same. Problems persisted and in some areas worsened. It is also crucial to take into consideration the accuracy in the accounting of the corresponding agencies on the IPs to ensure a more appropriate response to their concerns. This calls for a renewed commitment to promoting the cause of the IPs. It likewise calls for an assessment or evaluation of the kind of theological methodology we have been using in viewing the reality of the IPs. While there are a plethora of Christian documents that best characterize the indispensable contributions of the Church in the promotion of the rights of the indigenous people, the recent demand for a reframing of Christian theology in the light of the current phenomenon of migration could be an avenue to tailor fit our theologization with the IPs in the context of the theology of migration, which highlights the theology of the other, theology of the stranger, theology of hope, theology of suffering, and so forth. 8. Brother Gaspar highlighted the missionary life of Tatay Bido and his contributions to the life of the IPs. Underscoring Tatay Bido's legacy invites to the framing of a theory or theology of dialogue that benchmarks the unique approach of Bishop Tudtud in dialoguing with the IPs. Brother Gaspar's testimony on the interreligious and intercultural legacies with the IPs of Bishop Tudtud showcase his contextual approach to interreligious and intercultural dialogue that can benchmark a Filipino way of doing a dialogue for us to learn. 9. As cautioned by Brother Gaspar during the Q&A, having a robust declaration and advocacies by the various agencies, religious traditions, in particular the Catholic Church, does not mean that everyone will accept it wholesale. Prejudices such as efforts toward reconciliation have taken years to build up. So we should not be surprised, nor should we be demoralized at all. So the important thing is that we see the paradigm of encounter with the IPs as an important part and mechanism for the church as well as for all religious traditions to build friendship with them. In a nutshell, I reckon that our good speaker is appealing to our sense of commitment that is modeled in the dialogue of friendship of Bishop Tudtud to consolidate our responses to the immediate and pressing concern regarding the promotion of the human rights of our IP brethren and all that these human rights signify, such as the right to ancestral domain, ethnic equality, and so on and so forth. As the saying goes, strength in numbers. So this is especially crucial in the lobbying power of the Uni-Harmony partners or of the church towards our lawmakers. So, madamo gid nga salamat.
Venus, please unmute. Venus.
Sorry po. Sorry. Thank you very much. Madamo nga salamat, Professor Fuentes. Wow, that was some takeaway. Mga estudyante dyan ni Professor Bong and our seminarians, I don't know if you were able to take all that kasi may exam, I think, no? About
Yes,
takeaways.
exactly. That's why Philip did a wonderful thing at summarizing.
Wonderful. Oo, ang dami,
Yeah.
no? Sinulat ko. Pero I think the last one, I think, is the one that we will all have to take away, and that is Brother Karl's effectiveness in appealing to our sense of commitment. I think that is really the best takeaway for all of us, no? For all that has been said, this is the one. And I think Brother Karl, always charismatic, nakadungog na ko ani sa iya when I was still a teenager in MSU. Wala naglubad, maopag yun gihapon, no? We used to idolize him. Wala siya kahibalo niya na. But really, once again, Brother Karl, we really want to thank you because you have really appealed to our affect this afternoon, you know. And I think what we need is not just our intellect, but also our affect in relation to building friendship and giving hope to the advocacy for our indigenous peoples, our Lumad brothers and sisters. So dugangan na ako, dadagdagan ko, Father Rex, yung dalawa mong R. You said, this is an opportunity to reconnect, reconnecting, remembering. Salamat, Tatay Bido. You know, I nearly cried when you mentioned again, Brother Karl, what happened on June 26, 1987. I think the two R's would be, to borrow from Professor Fuentes, maybe the revitalization of our commitment, revitalize our commitment for the Lumad and indigenous peoples, and also the importance of reframing, our theological methodologies. I think that's very important. That's a challenge to our seminaries and our educational institutions. I also would like to remember at this time Bishop Alan Casicas. Let us pray for him. He is in hot waters. Let us pray for the people of Marbel, the Diocese of Marbel. So with that, again, daghan kaayong salamat, maraming salamat. Thank you very much, sukran, to all of you, most especially to Brother Karl. Bahalag balik-balik at Brother Karl kadadlaw maghisgot ani. We will not get bored. Thank you so much. And special thanks to Professor Bong and to Father Rex Rocamora, our relentless organizers, of the webinar, the most active promoters of the webinar, whether in Facebook or in Messenger. And of course, thank you to our dear John Dean and Arlene Villahermosa of the GCCM for your generosity, kanunay way paglubad, and of course to the Missionary Society of St. Columbans, always partners. Wherever there is need, the Columbans are there. Thank you very much, to everyone. We cannot thank you enough, Brother Karl. We cannot thank everyone enough for all who have participated, young and old, professionals and neophytes. Thank you very much. Hinaot magpadayon kita niining atong paghigugma, pagtabang sa atong mga igsuong mga lumad. Tinabangay kay ingon pa si Professor Fuentes, there is strength in numbers. So, may I call in Bishop Edwin de la Peña for his closing words of gratitude and blessings.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brother Karl Gaspar, for your very nice presentation. And also to all who have joined us in this webinar, continuing webinar to refresh us of the legacy of Tatay Bido. And also, we look forward to another one sometime in November, I think, November. So we look forward to that. And so to all of you who have joined us, thank you very much. God, magbabaya, bathala, we call God by many different names, but in the spirit of Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti, we are all brothers and sisters to one another. And so there should never be any kind of exclusion among us. Rather, we should welcome one another. And in that spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood, we work for the benefit of the least among us, especially our indigenous peoples. So we continue, O Lord, to strengthen our commitment to this apostolate for the indigenous peoples. Amen.